There is a moment that arrives without announcement. A quiet turning point in the soul where everything you've been running toward simply stops. Not because you've finally arrived at some destination, but because something deep inside you releases a breath it's been holding for lifetimes. You don't notice it at first because it's so subtle, like the last leaf falling from a tree in autumn, silent, inevitable, and somehow final in its gentle descent. You've been searching for so long now, haven't you? Reading all the books that promised awakening, listening to teachers who spoke of enlightenment as if it were a mountain peak to be conquered, meditating at dawn with the discipline of a monk, chasing peak experiences like a desperate traveler, chasing the horizon line that never seems to get closer, always moving, always seeking, always just one step away from something you couldn't quite name but felt certain you would recognize the moment you found it. But tonight, something is different. Tonight, something shifts in the architecture of your inner world. The search itself begins to feel heavy, like you've been carrying water in your cupped hands for miles and miles. And only now are you starting to question why you picked it up in the first place. And in that questioning, a realization dawns. You've been so busy looking for the light, scanning every horizon and peering into every shadow, that you completely forgot to notice you were already standing in it. Alan Watts once whispered a truth into the void that most of us spend our entire lives trying to unhear. The meaning of life is just to be alive. It is so plain and so obvious and so simple, and yet everybody rushes around in a great panic as if it were necessary to achieve something beyond themselves. Beyond themselves, always beyond, always somewhere else, always in some future moment when you'll finally be ready, finally be worthy, finally be enough. But what if the beyond you've been seeking is actually here, woven into the ordinary fabric of this very moment? What if the sacred experience you've been postponing, waiting until you're more spiritual or more healed or more awake, is actually happening right now in the simple act of breathing, of existing, of being this particular expression of consciousness reading these words? What if everything you thought you needed to become is just a beautiful distraction from recognizing what you've always been? There's a strange relief that comes with this recognition, a softening that feels almost like grief but isn't quite sadness. It's more like a fist that's been clenched for years finally opening. Not in defeat, but in the profound recognition that it was never holding anything real in the first place. You are tired, so deeply tired of becoming someone else, of fixing yourself as if you were broken, of walking this endless pilgrimage to a shrine that mysteriously moves every single time you get close enough to touch it. And in that tiredness, in that sacred exhaustion that comes from finally admitting you can't do this anymore, something ancient begins to stir. It's a knowing that has no words, a presence that has no form, an understanding that doesn't come from the mind but from somewhere far older and far deeper. It doesn't announce itself with trumpets or visions or mystical experiences. It doesn't need to, because it's been here all along, waiting patiently beneath every thought, every breath, every desperate prayer you've ever whispered into the darkness. This is the moment it begins. Not the beginning of your journey, but the end of the journey of seeking itself. This is where everything you thought you knew starts to quietly unravel. And beneath that unraveling, something true remains. If you've ever felt this quiet unraveling inside you, this gentle collapse of everything you thought you needed to become, comment below. It's beginning. So the universe knows. You've heard the call. Here's what nobody tells you about spiritual awakening. It doesn't feel like rising. It feels like falling. It feels like everything solid you've built your identity upon begins to crack and crumble. And instead of ascending toward some glorious light, you find yourself descending into a darkness that somehow feels more honest than any light you've ever chased. The teachers speak of transcendence, of rising above the human condition, of becoming more than what you are. But the actual experience is far more humbling, far more devastating, and infinitely more sacred than any of those lofty promises suggested. You're not falling apart. Let me say that again, because your mind will try to convince you otherwise in the months and years to come. You're not falling apart. You're falling inward. You're falling into yourself, into the vast spaciousness that's always been there beneath the costume of your personality, beneath the mask of your name and your story and all the things you've been told you should want. This collapse isn't destruction, it's revelation. It's the universe stripping away everything that was never really you in the first place. Ram Dass understood this paradox better than most. He spent years climbing the ladder of achievement, earning his doctorate, becoming Dr. Richard Alpert, building a respectable life in the halls of Harvard, and then he had to watch all of it dissolve. He had to become nobody in order to discover who he really was. He once said, "We're all just walking each other home." But what he didn't say explicitly is that the journey home requires you to lose every map you've ever carried, every identity you've ever worn, every idea you've had about who you're supposed to be. The ego doesn't understand this language. The ego speaks in terms of accumulation, more knowledge, more experiences, more enlightenment, more awakening. It wants to add spirituality to its resume, to become a better version of itself, to upgrade the software while keeping the same operating system. But consciousness doesn't work that way. Consciousness doesn't add, it subtracts. It removes layer by layer everything that obscures the simple truth of what you are. It's not about becoming something more. It's about recognizing you were never the limited thing you thought you were to begin with. This is why the spiritual path is so often described as a death. Because it is. Not a physical death, but something far more intimate. The death of the one who is seeking. The death of the narrator who's been telling your life story since you were old enough to think. The death of the reference point that says, "I am this and not that." And like any death, it's terrifying to the one who's dying, even as something deeper knows this is exactly what needs to happen. Lao Tzu whispered this secret thousands of years ago. "When I let go of what I am, I become what I might be." But he was being poetic, softening the blow. The truth is even more radical. When you let go of what you think you are, you don't become something else. You recognize you never were that thing in the first place. You were always the space in which all things arise and dissolve. You were always the awareness witnessing the story, not the character in the story itself. Right now, in this moment, you might be feeling the first tremors of this recognition. Maybe your life looks fine on the outside. Successful career, loving relationships, all the boxes checked. But inside, something feels off. There's a restlessness you can't quite name, a dissatisfaction that has nothing to do with circumstances. You've tried to fix it by changing jobs, changing partners, changing cities, changing habits. But the feeling follows you like a shadow because it's not about what's happening in your life. It's about a fundamental misunderstanding of who you are. Or maybe your life is actively falling apart. Maybe the structure you built so carefully is crumbling, and you're terrified because you genuinely don't know who you'll be without it. The relationship ends. The career implodes. The identity you wore like armor cracks down the middle. And in the raw vulnerability of that breaking, something whispers, "Good. Now we can begin." This is the sacred breakdown. This is where form meets void, where ego encounters essence, where everything you've been holding together with willpower and positive thinking finally surrenders to something larger. Alan Watts called it the wisdom of insecurity. This understanding that our desperate need for solid ground is actually what keeps us from dancing. We want guarantees, certainties, a path clearly marked with signs that say enlightenment this way. But the path doesn't work like that. The path requires you to walk into the unknown with empty hands and an open heart, trusting something you can't see and can't name. The resistance to this is enormous. Every fiber of your conditioned being wants to fight it, to regain control, to rebuild the walls that are crumbling, to resurrect the identity that's dissolving. You'll make deals with the universe. Let me keep this one thing. Let me hold on to this one definition of myself. Let me stay who I've been just a little longer. But the dissolution has its own intelligence, its own timing, its own fierce compassion. It won't stop until everything false has been burned away. And here's the most beautiful paradox of all. What you're afraid of losing was never real to begin with. The solid self you think you are is actually more like a verb than a noun, more like a river than a stone. You are a process, not a thing. You are happening, not existing as some fixed entity frozen in time and space. The person you were yesterday is already gone. The person you'll be tomorrow hasn't arrived yet. And the person you are right now is so fleeting, so ephemeral, that by the time you try to grasp it, it's already transformed into something else. So what remains when everything temporary dissolves? What's left when the story ends? When the character takes off their costume, when the dream recognizes itself as dreaming? Not nothing, that's the surprise. Not emptiness in the sense of absence or void, but a presence so vast, so full, so utterly complete that it has no need to become anything other than what it is. A silence so profound that it contains every sound. A stillness so deep that all movement arises from it and returns to it like waves on an infinite ocean. This is what you're falling into. Not darkness, but depth. Not destruction, but dissolution of everything that was never substantial to begin with. The spiritual teachers were trying to point at this when they spoke of surrender. But surrender sounds passive, like giving up. This is active recognition. This is seeing through the illusion with such clarity that you can't unsee it. Even when part of you desperately wants to go back to sleep, back to the comfortable story, back to the familiar prison of who you thought you were. There's a voice beyond time that speaks in the silence between your thoughts. And it's been saying the same thing since before you were born. You are not the wave. You are the ocean pretending very convincingly to be a wave. And the moment you remember this, the fear ends, the search ends. The suffering of separation ends, not because the wave disappears, but because it recognizes its own nature. You don't have to believe this. You don't have to understand it. You just have to be willing to let everything you think you know dissolve long enough to discover what remains. If you've ever felt that everything falling apart was actually life rearranging itself into something truer, something more real than the story you've been telling, write in the comments, "I'm falling inward." Now we arrive at the threshold where words begin to fail, where language reaches its limit and dissolves into something that can only be felt, never fully spoken. This is the territory of silence, not the absence of sound, but the presence of something so complete that it needs no expression. If you've stayed with me this far, if you've allowed yourself to fall inward through the breaking open of everything you thought was solid, then you've earned the right to rest here for a moment in the quiet depths where transformation actually happens. Listen carefully to what I'm about to say, because it will sound like nothing and yet it contains everything. The answers you've been seeking don't live in more knowledge, more understanding, more spiritual concepts added to your collection. They live in the space between your thoughts, in the gap between one breath and the next, in the pause before you speak, in the stillness that exists before any movement begins. This space has always been here, vast and unchanging, but you've been moving too fast to notice it, thinking too loud to hear it, seeking too desperately to simply be with it. There is a meditation practice in certain Buddhist traditions where students are taught to count their breaths from 1 to 10, and then begin again. It sounds simple, almost insultingly simple, until you actually try it and discover that you rarely make it past 3, before your mind wanders off into planning or remembering or analyzing or judging. But the practice isn't really about the counting at all. It's about noticing the space between the breaths, that tender moment of suspension, where the inhale has ended but the exhale hasn't yet begun, where nothing is happening and yet everything is happening. That space is what you are beneath all the noise, beneath all the doing, beneath all the becoming. Right now, as you listen to these words, I want you to notice something. Between the words I'm speaking, there are pauses, brief moments of silence. And in those pauses, something is communicating that has nothing to do with language. It's the silence itself that carries the deepest teaching, not the words that attempt to point at it. The ancient mystics knew this secret. They spoke in paradoxes and koans not to confuse their students, but to short-circuit the thinking mind long enough for something deeper to be recognized. They knew that truth can't be taught. It can only be uncovered in the quiet space where all teaching falls away. Alan Watts had a way of describing this that cuts through all the mystical poetry and gets right to the heart of it. He said we've been educated into a world of symbols, a world where we've confused the menu with the meal, the map with the territory, the word water with actual water. We spend our entire lives thinking about life, talking about life, planning for life, but we forget to actually live. We forget that life isn't something that happens in language. It happens in the immediate wordless experience of this moment, which is always slipping through your fingers the moment you try to grasp it with thoughts. Breathe with me now. Not a special spiritual breath, not a technique or a practice, just the simple breath that's been breathing you since the moment you were born. Notice how it comes and goes without any effort on your part, without any decision or control. You're not breathing, you're being breathed. And in that recognition, something shifts. The burden of having to maintain yourself, to keep yourself going, to make yourself be conscious, all of that falls away when you realize it's all happening by itself, through you as you. The silence I'm pointing at isn't the opposite of noise. You can be in the middle of a crowded city, surrounded by traffic and voices and chaos, and still touch this silence because it exists at a different level altogether. It's the silence of the witness. The awareness that notices everything but is itself untouched by anything it notices. It's the screen on which the movie of your life plays out. Never affected by the drama, never changed by the story, always present, always still, always here. There's a teaching story from the Zen tradition about a student who came to the master desperate for enlightenment. The student had studied all the texts, practiced all the meditations, attended all the retreats, but still felt no closer to the truth. "Master," he said, "I've done everything you've asked. When will I finally awaken?" The master looked at him for a long moment and then said, "Have you eaten your breakfast?" "Yes," the student replied, confused. "Then wash your bowl," the master said, and walked away. The student stood there baffled, waiting for the real teaching, not understanding that he had just received it. Awakening isn't somewhere else. It's in the simple act of washing your bowl, of being fully present to the ordinary moment in front of you, stripped of all your ideas about what enlightenment should look like. This is what the silence teaches when you finally stop running from it. It teaches you that you don't need to become anything other than what you already are in this moment, not the story about this moment, not your interpretation or analysis or judgment of this moment, but the raw, unfiltered experience of being alive right now, the warmth or coolness of the air on your skin, the sensation of your breath moving in and out, the subtle sounds in your environment that you usually filter out, the feeling of simply existing, prior to any thought about that existence. Most people are terrified of this silence because they've confused it with loneliness or emptiness or death. They fill every moment with noise, music, television, conversation, social media, constant thinking, because when the noise stops, they're afraid they'll disappear. And there's truth to that fear, but not in the way they imagine. What disappears in the silence isn't you. It's the false you, the constructed you, the you that's just a collection of memories and thoughts and conditioning. And yes, that disappearance feels like death to the ego. But to your true nature, it feels like coming home after a long journey in a foreign land. I'm going to share something with you that might sound strange. The silence has intelligence. It's not passive or inert or empty. It's alive, aware, creative, responsive. When you learn to rest in it rather than flee from it, you discover that this silence is actually the source of everything. Every thought, every feeling, every action arises from it and returns to it like waves on the ocean. And when you recognize yourself as the ocean rather than just the wave, when you identify with the silence rather than just the noise that arises in the silence, everything changes. Not in your circumstances necessarily, but in your relationship to whatever circumstances appear. The Tao Te Ching speaks of this with perfect simplicity. The Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. The name that can be named is not the eternal name. In other words, the deepest truth can't be spoken because it exists before language, before concepts, before the division of reality into this and that, me and you, good and bad. It can only be experienced directly, intimately in the immediacy of pure presence. And that presence is available right now, has always been available, will always be available because it's what you are at the deepest level. So I invite you to pause here, not to think about what I'm saying, but to simply be with the silence these words are pointing toward. Let your mind rest. Let your seeking rest. Let everything rest for just a moment in the spaciousness that holds all experience. You don't need to do anything special or achieve any particular state. Just notice what's here when you stop trying to get somewhere else. When you stop trying to become someone else. When you stop trying to figure it all out. Notice the quiet awareness that's reading these words. The consciousness that's aware of your thoughts and feelings, but isn't itself a thought or a feeling. That's what you are. That's what's been here all along, patiently waiting for you to stop and recognize it. If you're still here, listening to the silence beneath these words, feeling the space between your thoughts. Comment: I am the space between breaths. Only those who have entered the stillness will understand. And now, in this sacred pause, in this stillness that you've allowed yourself to sink into, something begins to stir. Not a thought exactly, not a feeling you can name, but a recognition so ancient and so immediate that it feels like you've always known it and are only now remembering. This is the moment where everything inverts, where the fall you thought was taking you down was actually spiraling you back to the beginning, back to the source, back to the truth that was never lost but only forgotten beneath layers of conditioning and story, and the exhausting work of pretending to be small. You are not who you thought you were. Let that land for a moment. You are not the collection of memories that stretches back to childhood. You are not the narrative voice in your head that comments on everything. You are not the emotions that rise and fall like weather patterns. You are not your accomplishments or your failures. You are not your body, though the body is a magnificent instrument through which you experience this world. You are not even your consciousness in the limited sense of, I am this particular person having these particular thoughts. You are the vastness in which all of this appears, the infinite space of awareness itself, temporarily and playfully pretending to be bound and separate and searching. This is what all the mystics were trying to tell you, what every spiritual teaching has been pointing toward with different words and different metaphors, but the same essential truth. You are already what you've been seeking. The seeker and the sought are one. The journey was a beautiful circle that brought you right back to where you always were. But now you can see it with new eyes, fresh recognition, the shock of the utterly obvious that was somehow invisible until this moment. There's a mirror that appears in dreams sometimes, a mirror that shows not your physical face but your true face, the face you had before your parents were born, as the Zen masters say. And when you look into that mirror, expecting to see the familiar stranger you've been identifying with your whole life, you see instead infinite space looking back at itself. You see consciousness recognizing its own nature. You see the dreamer realizing it's the dream and the dreaming and the one who witnesses it all. And in that recognition, something that was tight releases. Something that was seeking stops. Something that was suffering dissolves into laughter at the cosmic joke of it all. Ram Dass spent years in India studying with his guru, Maharaj Ji, practicing meditation, purifying his mind, trying to become enlightened. And one day his teacher looked at him and said something that changed everything. You're already free. You just forgot. Not you need to become free. Not you're on the path to freedom. But you're already free. The prison was always imaginary. The chains were always made of thought. The separation between you and the divine, between you and truth, between you and peace, it was always just a story you believed so completely that it became your reality. This is the fire that burns away everything false. Not a destructive fire, but a purifying one. The fire of clear seeing that consumes every lie you've told yourself about your limitations. You thought you were broken and needed to be fixed. You thought you were incomplete and needed to find your missing piece. You thought you were separate and needed to reunite with Source. But none of it was ever true. You were whole before the thought of brokenness appeared. You were complete before the feeling of lack arose. You were never separate from the Source because you are the Source experiencing itself through this particular window of perception. All those years of spiritual seeking, all those books and practices and teachings and techniques, they weren't making you into something you weren't. They were slowly, patiently, compassionately removing your belief in what you are not, layer by layer. Like an artist removing stone to reveal the sculpture that was always there. You weren't becoming enlightened. You were being freed from the illusion that you were ever unenlightened in the first place. And here's where it gets really interesting, where the mind wants to step in and make this into another concept to grasp, another achievement to claim. This recognition doesn't make you special. It doesn't elevate you above anyone else or give you some secret knowledge that others lack. In fact, it's quite the opposite. In seeing your own true nature, you simultaneously see that this is everyone's true nature. The same awareness looking out of your eyes is looking out of every pair of eyes. The same consciousness animating your body is animating all bodies. The same presence reading these words right now is the same presence that wrote them. The same presence that exists in the space between the words. The same presence that has been here since before time began and will be here after time ends. There's a portal that opens when you stop resisting what is. When you stop trying to control how life unfolds, when you surrender not in defeat, but in recognition that you were never in control to begin with. And through that portal you discover something extraordinary, the present moment, which you've been trying to escape your entire life through planning and remembering and fantasizing, is actually the only place where life happens. It's the only place where you can experience joy or peace or love or anything real. The past is a memory arising now. The future is a thought appearing now. Everything, absolutely everything, is only ever happening now, in this eternal present that was never born and can never die. Alan Watts described this as the eternal now, and he wasn't being poetic or mystical, he was stating a simple fact. There has never been a moment that wasn't now. Even your memories of the past are happening now. Even your thoughts about the future are happening now. The present moment isn't a thin slice of time sandwiched between past and future. It's the entire field of existence, the only reality there is or ever was or ever will be. And you are that. You are this nowness wearing a human form, experiencing itself through the beautiful and temporary lens of personality and story and individual perspective. Listen to your breath again. Feel it moving in and out. This ancient rhythm that connects you to every living thing. This tide that's been flowing since your first moment and will continue until your last. But notice something deeper than the breath. Notice what's aware of the breath. Notice the consciousness that witnesses the inhale and the exhale without being touched by either. That witnessing awareness, that pure presence that knows but is never known, that sees but is never seen. That's what you are. That's what's been here beneath every experience you've ever had, every thought you've ever thought, every emotion you've ever felt. And in recognizing this, something miraculous happens. The heart that's been seeking finally finds what it was looking for. Not out there in some mystical dimension or future moment of enlightenment, but right here in the simple fact of being. The heart breaks open, not in pain but in relief, in recognition, in the overwhelming gratitude of finally coming home. Tears might come, or laughter, or a profound quietness. It doesn't matter. What matters is that in this moment you remember. You remember who you've always been beneath the forgetting. You remember what you are beyond the story of who you thought you were. This is the rebirth that happens through death, the ascension that comes through descent, the finding that emerges from loss. Everything you released in the falling, everything you surrendered in the silence, everything you allowed to dissolve in the darkness, it's all revealed to be the necessary clearing for this recognition. You had to lose yourself to find yourself. You had to die to who you weren't to be reborn as who you are. And now, standing in the ashes of everything that's burned away, you discover that what remains is indestructible, unchangeable, eternal. You are the night sky that holds all the stars. You are the silence that contains all sound. You are the stillness from which all movement flows. You are the awareness in which the entire universe appears, including the body and mind you've been calling me. And this recognition doesn't negate your human experience. It illuminates it, sanctifies it, reveals it to be the divine play of consciousness exploring itself through form. If this truth resonated through you, if you felt something ancient stirring in recognition of itself, right, I remember who I am. Let these words echo through the field of consciousness. And so we arrive here, at the end that is not an ending but a return to the beginning, to the source from which everything emerges and to which everything returns. The words that carried you this far begin to fade now, dissolving like morning mist when the sun rises, revealing that what they were pointing to was never in the words themselves but in the silence between them, in the space where you and the listening became one undivided presence. There is nothing more to seek because seeking itself has revealed its own futility, its own beautiful purposelessness. You can rest now. You can let the weight of becoming fall away like old clothes you no longer need. The spiritual search that brought you here has completed itself not by arriving at some final destination, but by recognizing that there was never anywhere to go, that the whole journey was consciousness playing hide and seek with itself, pretending to be lost so it could experience the joy of being found. What remains when all the seeking stops? What's here when the story of me and my journey and my awakening quietly fades into the background? Just this. Just the simple isness of existence itself. Prior to any interpretation, prior to any meaning, prior to any division into experiencer and experienced. There's a breathing happening. There's an awareness of that breathing. And somewhere beneath both of those, there's a vast okayness with whatever is, a fundamental peace that doesn't depend on circumstances or understanding, or even on the presence or absence of peace itself. The ego, that beautiful and necessary fiction, begins to lose its solid edges here in the dissolution. Not that it disappears completely. You still have preferences, still have a personality, still show up as this particular expression of consciousness in the world. But the identification with it loosens. You begin to wear your personality lightly, like an actor who knows the role is just a role, who can step on stage and play the part fully while never forgetting the awareness that watches from beyond the character. The I that you've been defending and protecting and trying to improve your whole life is revealed to be more like a habit than a reality, more like a thought pattern than an entity, more like a verb than a noun. There's a tenderness that emerges in this dissolution, a gentleness with yourself and with all of life that wasn't possible when you thought you had to be someone, achieve something, prove something, when you're no longer trying to maintain an identity, when you're no longer carrying the burden of a separate self that needs to survive and succeed and matter, there's suddenly room for everything to be exactly as it is. The parts of yourself you've been rejecting can finally come home. The experiences you've been resisting can finally move through you. The present moment, which you've been at war with your entire life, can finally be met with open arms. Alan Watts spoke of this as the wisdom of insecurity, but perhaps it's more accurate to call it the wisdom of dissolution. When you stop trying to solidify yourself, stop trying to make permanent what is inherently fluid, stop trying to capture and hold what can only be experienced in its passing, life becomes less of a problem to be solved and more of a mystery to be lived. You flow with it rather than against it. You dance with uncertainty rather than demanding guarantees. You rest in the not knowing that is actually more honest, more real, more aligned with the nature of existence than any false certainty could ever be. The breathing continues. In and out, rising and falling. The heart beats without any effort from you. The blood flows. The cells regenerate. The thoughts appear and disappear like clouds crossing an empty sky. And through it all, beneath it all, as it all, there's this witnessing presence, this consciousness that you are watching the show without being caught in the drama, participating fully while remaining fundamentally untouched. This is what the Buddha meant by nirvana, not some transcendent realm you escape to after death, but the recognition that the fire of craving and aversion has gone out, that the struggle against what is has ended, that you can rest in the simple suchness of things as they are. It's what the Christian mystics called the peace that passes understanding, what the Sufis called fana or annihilation in God, what the Taoists called wu wei or effortless action. Different words, different traditions, different cultures, but all pointing at the same recognition. When you stop fighting reality, when you dissolve into what is rather than what should be, something holy happens. And here, at the very edge of language where words begin to fail completely, I want to say something that might sound like nothing but contains everything. You don't need to understand this. You don't need to figure it out or integrate it or make sense of it intellectually. The mind that wants to grasp and comprehend and box everything up neatly is itself part of what's dissolving here. You can let it do what it does, analyze, question, doubt. And you can simultaneously rest in something deeper that doesn't need the mind's approval or understanding. There's a quality of spaciousness that opens up in this dissolution, a feeling of being simultaneously everything and nothing, of mattering infinitely and not mattering at all in the most liberating way possible. You are a wave in an infinite ocean, unique and temporary and completely inseparable from the whole. Your life matters because all life matters, because consciousness loves experiencing itself through every form, through every perspective, through every fleeting moment of existence. And your life doesn't matter in the sense that its ultimate purpose isn't to achieve or accomplish or leave a mark, but simply to be, to exist, to dance this brief dance before dissolving back into the source. The ancient mystics knew that silence is the highest teaching, that what cannot be spoken is actually what matters most. So these final words release themselves, letting go of any attempt to capture or convey or point to what you already are beneath every word, every concept, every teaching. The dissolution isn't something that happens to you. It's what you are when you stop pretending to be what you're not. It's the natural state that remains when all the effort and seeking and becoming finally exhausts itself and falls away. Breathe. Just breathe. Let this breath be enough. Let this moment be complete. Let yourself dissolve into the vastness that you've always been. The awareness that was here before you were born and will remain after the body falls away. You are not in the universe. You are the universe experiencing itself as you, as this, as now. And when you see this, really see it, the search ends not because you've found something, but because you've recognized what was never lost. The storyteller takes a bow and exits the stage. The seeker finds what it was seeking by ceasing to seek. The wave remembers its ocean. And in that remembering, in that final dissolution of the separate self, there's just this pure presence, aware and awake, and utterly at peace with whatever appears in the infinite mirror of consciousness. Nothing needs to happen. Nothing needs to change. Nothing needs to be understood or achieved or become. It's already done. It's always been done. You are already home. Rest here, in the space between breaths, in the silence between thoughts, in the vastness that holds all things without being touched by anything. This is what you are. This is what you've always been. This is what remains when everything else dissolves into the quiet truth of existence itself. The words end here, but what they pointed to has no beginning and no ending. It simply is. And so are you. If you felt yourself dissolve into this silence, if you recognized yourself as the space in which all experience arises and returns, comment, "I was never separate," and may your remembrance ripple through all who are ready to awaken.